The fire had burned low. Gideon Marsh sat at the rough-hewn table in the center of his cabin, the only light in the room coming from the last orange embers in the iron stove. Outside, Wyoming Territory was doing what it did every December, trying to erase everything. The wind came down from the mountains like something with a personal grievance, and the snow it carried was not falling so much as it was attacking, driving sideways against the single-pane window until the glass shook in its frame like a man trying to hold himself together under questioning. Gideon did not look at the window. He was looking at a piece of paper. It was old. The edges had gone soft from years of being folded and unfolded, and the ink in the upper right corner had faded to the color of weak tea left too long in the cup. A man less familiar with it might have called it fragile. Gideon knew better. Some things grew more dangerous with age, not less. The words in the center of the page were still legible. They had always been legible. That was the problem. That had always been the problem. He had read this document more times than he could count. He knew where every sentence broke and where every paragraph ended. He knew which words the lawyer had chosen to make theft sound like commerce, and which phrases had been constructed specifically because a man who had never studied law would not catch their meaning on a first reading or a second, or possibly a third. He had not understood what this document actually was until the third year he lived on this land, when a different lawyer in a different town had taken one look at it and explained in the unhurried voice of a man delivering news. He assumed the other already suspected what a land conveyance deed with a contested ancestral claim actually meant. It meant that someone had already owned this land before Gideon Marsh had ever set foot on it. It meant that someone had signed that ownership away under circumstances that any honest court would have called coercion at minimum and outright fraud at maximum. And it meant that at the very bottom of the page, in the careful and deliberate handwriting of a 30-year-old man who had just come home from a war with nothing left to his name, but the name itself, was the signature of Gideon Marsh, listed under the single word, witness. He set the paper down on the table. He had been doing that for 3 years, picking it up in the evenings when the work was done and the silence got too loud, reading it through to the bottom, setting it back down, not doing anything about it. He had told himself many things during those 3 years, the way a man in a cold room tells himself the fire is about to catch. He had told himself that he had not known what he was signing. That was true. He had told himself that he had been deceived by a man more powerful and more experienced than him. That was also true. He had told himself that the law was the law, and what was recorded in the county offices in the legal handwriting of legal men was not something one rancher on 40 acres could simply undo by wishing it otherwise. That, too, had truth in it. But the whole truth was simpler than any of those partial truths, and harder, and he had known it from the beginning. The whole truth was that Harlan Voss was the most powerful man in 3 counties, with connections that reached all the way to the territorial government in Cheyenne and possibly further, and that Gideon Marsh was one aging rancher at the edge of the world with a bad knee and a worse reputation for keeping to himself. And he was afraid. He had been afraid for 3 years. He was still afraid now. He folded the paper with the same careful creases it had always had, and put it in the left breast pocket of his shirt. He had carried it there every single day for 3 years. Not as penance exactly. As a reminder. A man who forgot what he owed to others had a way of sleeping too soundly for his own good, and Gideon Marsh had decided somewhere along the way that he did not deserve to sleep soundly. Not yet. He stood and crossed to the stove and added 2 split pieces of pine. The fire caught, and the room brightened, and he could see the full inventory of his life in that space if he chose to look at it that way. 1 chair at the table, 1 shelf of books with broken spines that he had read through twice each, a coat hanging on a nail beside the door stiff with years of use, the rifle above the mantel that he cleaned every Sunday morning the way some men went to church, not because he needed the ritual, but because the ritual needed him. No photographs on the walls, no letters bundled and kept, no evidence anywhere in that room that any other living person had ever been made glad by his presence in the world. He went to bed. Sometime well past midnight the horse began to scream. It was not the sound horses made when they were cold or hungry, or when a coyote tested the fence line at the tree line edge. Gideon had kept horses through most of his adult life, and he had learned their language as you learned any language from someone your life depended on. He knew the sounds of discomfort and the sounds of fear and the sounds of the particular equine impatience that passed for complaint. This was none of those. This was the high, sustained, insistent note of an animal that had found something beyond its capacity to categorize and was asking the only creature it trusted to come and make sense of it. He was out of the bed before he was fully awake. Boots pulled on in the dark, coat from the nail, the lantern from the shelf lit with hands that moved from memory because there was no light to see by. He did not take the rifle from above the mantel. He stood there for one moment with his hand near it and then left it where it was. Some instinct he could not have articulated told him that whatever had frightened the horse a rifle was not what the situation called for. He pulled open the cabin door, and the cold hit him, the way cold hits a man who has been inside too long, total and immediate and slightly personal in its intensity. The temperature had dropped further while he slept, and the wind was coming now in short, brutal gusts that found every gap in his coat and every inch of exposed skin and worked at them methodically. The snow was mid-shin on the porch steps and still coming, and when he held the lantern up, it showed him almost nothing beyond a radius of perhaps 8 feet. Just white. Just wind. Just the vague, dark shapes of the fence posts at the edge of visibility standing their ground. He followed the sound of his horse across the yard. The animal had broken through the latch on the stable door, a heavy iron latch that Gideon had installed himself 3 winters ago, specifically because the horse had a talent for working latches open when it felt strongly enough about something. It stood 20 feet from the stable in the full force of the storm hooves planted, not moving, not looking at him when he approached. It was looking at the ground. He raised the lantern and looked at what the horse was looking at. The shape in the snow was large enough that his first thought, the immediate animal thought that arrived before the reasoning mind could intervene, was bear. Something in the back of his brain surveyed the mass of it and reached for the nearest available explanation. But bears did not wear moccasins. Bears did not have hands. And the hands he could see half submerged in the snow on either side of that vast and motionless body were human hands. The wrists above them were wrapped in strips of torn material that had once been binding cords cut or broken with tremendous force, if the frayed and darkened ends were any evidence, and the skin above those improvised bandages was torn open in places that were no longer bleeding only because the cold had done what pressure had not. He knelt in the snow beside her. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck below the angle of the jaw, searching for a pulse the way a field medic in a different war had taught him to do it firmly and without hesitation, because hesitation in that moment was its own kind of failure. He found what he was looking for. It was faint. It was slow. It was irregular in a way that worried him. But it was there, and there was the only thing that mattered in that moment. He got his arms beneath her and lifted. The effort required everything he had and then required more on top of that. He was not a small man, and the years of working this land alone had preserved more of what the army had built than he sometimes gave himself credit for. But this was not an ordinary situation, and she was not an ordinary person. She was built the way the landscape she had come from was built, with a density and solidity that had nothing to do with simple weight and everything to do with the quality of what she was made of, the way old-growth timber felt different in the hand than wood, from younger trees, heavier per board foot, harder to the touch, more resistant to everything. He got her off the ground. He turned toward the cabin. He walked. Each step through the snow was its own separate negotiation with the wind and the cold and the failing strength in his arms and legs. He did not think about the distance. He thought about the next step, and then the one after that, which was the only way he had ever managed anything worth managing in his life. He got her through the door. He got her onto the floor in front of the stove as carefully as he could manage, which was not very carefully by the end because his arms had very nearly nothing left in them. She did not stir. He stoked the fire until it was burning hard enough to push the cold back from the center of the room, and then he knelt beside her with the lantern held close, and he looked at what the storm had delivered to him. She was younger than the dark and the cold had suggested, mid-20s perhaps, Her face was striking in a way that the word beautiful did not quite reach the bone structure of her jaw and brow and cheekbones, something that had been assembled with a precision that seemed almost architectural. Her hair was black and matted with ice that was already beginning to melt in the heat of the stove. She was dressed in a combination of traditional Apache garments and pieces that had clearly come from other sources, a wool shirt too large for even her frame boots that had been resoled badly with someone else's leather, and the combination of it told a story of displacement and survival and exchange that he could not yet fully read. She was, he observed, with the detached attention of a man conducting an assessment rather than making a personal observation, remarkable in her physical scale. Even lying still, she occupied the floor the way certain landscapes occupied the eye completely and without apology. Her shoulders were as broad as most men's he had known. Her arms, lying slack beside her body, carried the kind of functional musculature that came not from any deliberate cultivation, but simply from a life that had required it over and over again until the body had no choice but to accommodate. He turned her carefully onto her side to assess her back, and what he found there drove everything else out of his mind. He had seen lash marks before. The war had provided him with more education in the varieties of human cruelty than he had ever asked for or wanted. But these marks were not the result of anger or frenzy. They had been applied with a deliberate and organized methodology spaced at regular intervals, delivered with a precision that spoke of someone who understood the difference between punishment and destruction, who had wanted to inflict the maximum amount of lasting pain while keeping the subject alive and physically functional. It was the mark of a particular kind of cruelty, the worst kind, the kind that was patient. He knew this particular pattern. He knew this particular pattern. He had seen it administered on the Voss property 5 years ago on a man who had tried to run. He had looked away then. He had told himself it was not his place. He had ridden out the next morning and never gone back, which was the only form of protest available to a man who lacked the courage for any other kind. He had walked away from what he had seen, and he had not gone back. And 3 months later, he had left that job and ridden to this piece of land and started building a life here, which he had understood even at the time was a form of running that he was choosing to call something else. He sat back on his heels and looked at his hands. Then he went to the shelf where he kept what passed for medical supplies in a place this far from town, and he got to work. He cleaned the wounds with what he had. He applied carbolic where he could. He wrapped what needed wrapping with strips of clean linen, working carefully and methodically, and without sentiment, because sentiment in field medicine was something you indulged after the patient was stable and not before. She remained unconscious through all of it, her breathing shallow and slow, and he checked the pulse at her neck every several minutes to confirm that it was holding. It held through the hour it took him to complete the work, through the additional hour he spent simply sitting beside her and watching the rise and fall of her breathing to make sure it remained what it was. Sometime past 3 in the morning, he allowed himself to sit back in his chair to rest for a few minutes. He woke to daylight the color of pewter coming through the window and to a hand around his throat. The grip was not intended to kill him. He understood this immediately, not because it was not strong enough to do so, but because it was not doing so. It was measuring him, assessing him. The way you tested a rope before committing your weight to it, closing your hand around it and pulling against it to find where and how it would resist. He sat very still. The hand was larger than any hand he had felt before, and the arm attached to it was extended with a stillness and steadiness that told him the person on the other end of it was not afraid of what she was holding. He looked up along that arm to her face. She was fully awake, completely, immediately awake, with no residue of sleep visible in her expression. Her eyes were the color of dark amber, almost golden in certain lights, and they were conducting the same methodical assessment that her hand was conducting, moving across his face and his posture and his hands and the room behind him with a thoroughness that missed nothing. He held her gaze and waited. After 5 seconds, perhaps 6, the hand released. She did not withdraw it immediately. She held the proximity for a moment longer, close enough that he could see the places at her hairline where he had not been able to clean the dried blood in the dark. Then she settled back against the wall beside the stove, drawing her knees up slowly and carefully in the manner of someone whose back was informing them loudly of its current condition. Her eyes moved across the room, the door, the window, the distance from where she sat to each of them. He watched her do this, and he recognized it for exactly what it was. It was not the behavior of a frightened person. It was the behavior of a trained person, someone for whom knowing the exits was not a response to fear, but a precondition for function as automatic and necessary as drawing breath. The fact that she was doing it now in this condition told him more about the length of time she had needed to live this way than any words could have. Her eyes came back to his face. "You are not one of them," she said. Her voice was low and roughened by cold and by whatever the past weeks had put her through, but even so, it had a quality that he associated with people accustomed to being listened to. Not loudness. Something else. Density. He shook his head once. She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded, leaned her head back against the wall, and let her eyes close. Not unconsciousness. A decision. However provisional, however carefully bounded, it was a choice, and he understood that for someone in her situation making any choice at all required a trust she had no logical reason to extend to him. He stood quietly and went to make coffee. He put 2 cups on the table. After a while she opened her eyes and looked at the second cup. Then she looked at him. He nodded toward it. She reached out and took it and wrapped both hands around it, and for a long time after that, in the warmth of the stove and the sound of the storm outside, that was all the conversation either of them needed. The storm lasted 4 more days. In those 4 days Gideon learned the shape of her wariness, the way you learn the shape of new terrain, not by being told about it, but by moving through it carefully and paying attention to where the ground became uncertain. He learned that she would not eat anything he brought her until she had watched him eat from the same pot first, and so he adjusted his routine without commenting on it, serving himself first and eating a portion before setting her share within reach. He learned that she slept in intervals of no more than 2 hours at a stretch, waking herself with an internal precision that suggested the habit was old and well established. He learned that she kept track of where he was in the cabin at all times, even when her back was turned to him, through the sounds of his movement and the particular quality of silences, and that she was better at this than most people he had known who were actively trying. He did not find any of this alarming. He found it informative. She had been taken bound, transported, and hurt by people she may or may not have known were capable of it. The appropriate response to that experience was not to stop being careful. The appropriate response was exactly what she was doing. On the first full day she confirmed her name was Waya. She offered nothing beyond it, and he asked for nothing. He knew that the name a person gave to a stranger was not always the whole name, and that in certain situations a partial name was an act of reasonable caution rather than deception, and that pressing for the rest of it was a way of putting your own curiosity above someone else's need to feel safe. He told her his name. She said it once to herself, quietly testing it. Then she set it aside and did not use it again for some time. What they had in those first days instead of conversation was proximity and routine. She watched him work. He moved through the tasks of keeping a ranch functioning in deep winter with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done the same things alone for long enough that they had become a form of thought rather than mere labor. Feeding the horse that had found her, checking the fence posts for storm damage through the window, splitting wood during the brief interval each afternoon when the wind eased enough to make it worth going outside, and stacking it with a regularity and precision that was not required by any practical necessity, but by something in him that had always needed to impose some form of order on the small controllable things when the large uncontrollable ones refused to cooperate. She watched all of it. Around her left wrist, tied with a thin strip of leather, was a small piece of bone carved into a shape he could not quite make out from across the room. She touched it occasionally, not with any visible awareness that she was doing so, the way a person touched something they had touched so many times it had become part of the habit of their hands. He noticed it on the second day and said nothing about it. On that same second day, while he was at the shelf with his back to her, she spoke. "The marks on my back," she said. "You recognized what made them." He turned around. She was watching him with the same still amber eyes she brought to everything, and her face was arranged in the expression he was beginning to understand was her default, which was to say it was arranged to give away as little as possible while receiving as much as the situation offered. "Yes," he said. "Then you know whose men they were." "Yes." A pause. The fire. The wind outside making its long circular sound against the roof. "And you brought me inside anyway," she said. It was not phrased as a question, and she did not deliver it as one. It was an observation she was presenting to him and waiting to see how he responded to it. "I didn't know whose men they were until I'd already gotten you off the ground," he said. "After that, it didn't seem like a choice I needed to make. It seemed like a thing that had already been decided." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the window and the subject appeared to be closed. But that evening he noticed that the position she settled into when she slept had shifted by several feet toward the center of the room away from the wall she had been pressed against the previous 2 nights, a distance of perhaps 3 feet. He noticed it and said nothing about it. On the 3rd day the temperature outside dropped further still and the snow intensified, and in the afternoon he sat down with a pair of boots that had been threatening to separate at the left sole for the better part of 6 weeks. He had the awl and the heavy needle and the waxed thread, and he set to work with the focused irritation of a man confronting a task he had deferred too long, knowing the deferral had made the eventual work harder. He had been at it for 20 minutes or so when she said from across the room, "You are doing that wrong." He looked up. She was not looking at him with any expression he could read as mockery or satisfaction. She was looking at his hands the way someone who understood a craft looked at a technique that was going to produce a predictable and avoidable failure. "Left side will pull through in 2 weeks," she said. "The stitch angle is too shallow." He held the boot out across the distance between them. She looked at it for a moment. Then she stood across the room and took it from his hand. She sat down on the floor a few feet away, not at the table with him, but closer than she had been to anything or anyone since she had woken in this cabin. She turned the boot in her hands. Her fingers were long, and the hands themselves were nearly half again the size of his, and they moved across the leather with a dexterity that seemed at first inconsistent with their scale, and then seemed entirely consistent with it because everything about her turned out on further observation to make a kind of internal sense. She reset the needle at the correct angle and made 8 stitches without pausing, each one placed with the assurance of long practice, and handed the boot back. He examined the work. It was significantly better than his own, better than most cobbler work he had seen in towns. "My father," she said, looking at the middle distance rather than at him. "He said that if you were going to keep something together, you should learn to do it the right way the first time, because the second time you always had less to work with." She stood and returned to her side of the room. He looked at the stitching for another moment. Then he went back to work on the right side of the boot, applying what she had shown him. That evening the wind came down harder than it had since the first night, shaking the cabin on its foundation timbers in a way that made conversation impossible for stretches at a time, and they sat on opposite sides of the stove and waited it out, in a silence that had changed in some quality he could feel but not precisely name, as though the air between them was the same air, but it had been rearranged. At some point past midnight she was deeply enough asleep that she was no longer monitoring the sounds of the room, and he sat in his chair and thought about what her father had said about keeping things together the right way the first time, and about all the things in his own life he had allowed to come apart because he had not wanted to pay the cost of the right method, and the thought sat in him with the particular weight of things that are true and cannot be set back down once they have been fully picked up. The 4th night she dreamed badly. He was awake, as he often was, in the coldest hours, lying still in the manner of a man who had long since accepted that sleep was not always available, and that fighting its absence only made the hours longer. He heard her breathing change, the shift from the deep rhythm of sleep into something faster and more shallow, and then he heard her say a name into the dark of the cabin. "Leah." Just that one word, not loud, barely voiced, more a shape made by the breath than a sound made by the throat. But it carried the specific gravity of a name that meant someone irreplaceable, and the sound of it in the dark made his chest tighten in a way he did not examine too closely. She woke herself. He heard the controlled exhale of a person forcing themselves back to the surface of consciousness and staying there through will, rather than readiness. He did not move. He kept his eyes on the dark ceiling and his breathing even. After a long interval of silence that had a different texture than the silences before it, she spoke into the room. "My sister," she said. 16 years old. She had never left the valley before they came. Before I was taken, she was taken separately. They did not keep us together. A pause in which he could hear the wind and the occasional settling of the fire. "I do not know where she was sent. I do not know if she is alive." Gideon thought about what a person needed to hear at a moment like that one, and about the long catalogue of wrong things he had said at wrong times across the span of his life, and about what those wrong things had cost the people he had said them to. "Tell me what she looks like," he said. Silence. Long enough that he thought she had decided not to answer. Then she told him. She told him the height already unusual for 16. She told him the way Leah arranged her hair, which was different from the way anyone else in the family did it, because Leah had always done things in her own way, regardless of convention. She told him about the small scar above the left eyebrow from a fall when she was 9 years old, and about the particular quality of Leah's laugh, which was too large for her body, and arrived without warning, and had the effect of pulling laughter out of people nearby, whether they had intended to laugh or not. He held all of it in the part of his memory that he still trusted. When she finished, he said, "All right." Just those 2 words. But he meant them in their fullest and most committed sense, and something in the way he said them must have carried that meaning, because the quality of her silence after that was different from the quality of her silence before. The silence of someone who has set something down, rather than the silence of someone who is still holding it and unable to say so. On the 5th morning the snow stopped. He woke to a stillness so complete after 4 days of wind and noise that it took him a moment to understand what was different. The light through the window was the sharp particular white of a Wyoming winter that had made its argument and was temporarily satisfied. And the world outside, when he opened the door, was an unbroken expanse of white that reached from the porch steps to the mountains and seemed to have erased everything that had existed before it. Waya stood at the window for a long time without speaking. "This valley," she said finally. "I know its shape." He looked up from the table. "My father described it to me," she said. "Many times. The way the western ridge bends at the southern end. The creek line that follows the low ground along the south pasture." She touched the glass with the tips of 2 fingers, not pressing, just touching. "He described it because he wanted me to be able to find it from the description alone if I ever needed to. He described it because it was ours, and he wanted me to know what ours meant." Gideon set down what he was holding. She turned from the window, and her eyes went to the wall behind the table, to the nail where the land deed had hung for the first 2 years he had lived here before he had moved it to his pocket. The nail was bare. There was nothing on it. But she looked at it the way you looked at the space where something had been when the shape of the absence told you enough. Then her eyes moved to his chest, to the left breast pocket of his shirt. She knew, or she suspected with enough certainty that the difference did not matter. He reached into his pocket. He took out the folded paper and placed it on the table between them. He left it closed. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at the worn quality of the folds, the way the paper had been creased and recessed so many times that the fold lines had gone soft. She looked at his hand that had placed it and was no longer touching it. She looked at the table between them, at the particular quality of the space between his hand and the document. And then she crossed the room and unfolded it herself. He watched her read. She moved through it slowly and with complete attention, tracking each line with the careful focus of someone who had learned English as a functional necessity and read it without the shortcuts that came from a lifetime of immersion. He watched her work through the legal language, the clauses, the terms of transfer. He watched her reach the section describing the property, and he saw in the brief stillness of her face that she recognized the landmarks. It described the same landmarks her father had given her in his own language across a distance of years. She reached the bottom of the page. Her finger moved to the mark in the lower left corner. Not a signature. A handprint rendered in faded ink, the mark of a man who had been brought to a table and told to make his mark on a document in a language he did not fully read, administered by people who had no intention of translating it faithfully. Her finger rested on that print for a moment, the print of her father's hand made on a day he had believed meant something else entirely. Then her eyes moved right to the witness line and to the name written there. She looked up at him. He did not look away. "I signed it," he said. His voice was level, and he kept it that way deliberately because this was not a moment for emotion in his delivery. She deserved the plain version. "I was 30 years old, and I had just come back from the war with nothing. Harlan Voss told me it was a land survey document requiring a literate witness for the county record. I signed it without reading it fully through. I should have read it." He stopped for a moment. Then he said, "That is not an excuse. That is only the true account of what happened." The room was very quiet. The stove made its small sounds. Outside, somewhere in the white distance, a bird called once and then was silent. She looked at him steadily for a long time. He sat under that look and did not move and did not add anything further to what he had said, because there was nothing further to say that would not be in service of making himself feel better rather than in service of the truth, and she had earned better than that from him. Then she folded the paper. She placed it back on the table precisely where he had set it. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the white valley and the shape of the western ridge and the frozen line of the creek in the south pasture, all of it still there, exactly as her father had described it. The land remembering everything that had happened on it, whether the people currently standing on it did or not. She stood there for a long time. He sat in his chair and waited. When she finally spoke, her voice was the same as it always was, controlled and even, and giving away only what she chose to give away. But underneath it, if you were paying the right kind of attention, there was something new, an additional weight, the weight of a wound that had not existed an hour ago. "He trusted the paper," she said. "He believed that because they made him put his hand to it, it carried his intention, that the mark was his, and therefore what it said was his. He told me when I was small that the marks would protect the land, that the men with the papers had said so, and that a mark on paper was how the world of those men worked, and he had learned to work in it." She stopped. Outside, a wind moved through the tops of the pines on the ridge, a sound like distant water. He was not a foolish man. He was a careful man. He understood the land and the animals and the weather and the movements of everything that lived within a day's ride in any direction. He understood everything they chose to give him the language to understand. "They made sure," Gideon said quietly, "that there were things he had no language for." "Yes," she said. "That was the work they were careful about." She was quiet for a moment more. "You have known what that paper is for how long?" she said. 3 years. "And you have done nothing?" "No." She turned from the window and looked at him. He held the look. "I was afraid," he said. And then he said the rest of it, because leaving it at one word was a form of dishonesty he could not afford at this particular moment. "Voss has more power in this territory than I have any means to contest alone. I have told myself other reasons, that I did not know enough, that the law was the law, that one man could not undo what a system had built." He looked at his hands on the table. "Those things have truth in them. But underneath them what is true is that I have been afraid, and I have let that be enough of a reason, and I have lived on this land for 10 years and done nothing to account for what my name on that paper helped to do." The silence after that was the longest silence they had shared. She looked at him with an expression he could not read and made no attempt to interpret. She did not offer him absolution. She did not condemn him. She did not say anything that would have made the next moment easier for him to inhabit. What she did was walk to the stove and sit down beside it, drawing her knees up with the careful slowness of her healing back, and look into the fire with the self-contained stillness of a person who has been given a great deal to carry and has long experience of carrying. He understood, watching her settle, that she was not forgiving him tonight, that it was not the night for that, and that asking for it or expecting it would have been the final proof that he had not understood anything at all. What she was doing was something harder and more honest than forgiveness. She was staying, in this room, on this land, with this man and his 30-year-old signature and his 3 years of fear. She was deciding in some private calculus he had no access to that staying was what the moment required. And he understood in the quiet of that cabin with the Wyoming winter pressing against every wall and the fire burning between them and the folded paper on the table with both their fathers' names on it, that for a woman who had survived what she had survived, the decision to stay anywhere at all was not a small or simple thing. It was, in fact, the most significant thing she had offered him. He sat with that, and with the fire, and with the particular quality of silence that had settled over the room, now a silence that was not empty, but full of everything that had been said, and everything that had not been, and everything that would still need to be said before this was done. Outside, the storm had ended. Something else careful and tentative, and as yet unnamed between them, had just begun. The first morning after the storm was the kind of morning that made Wyoming look like it had never intended anything cruel. The sky came up clear and absolute, the blue of it so deep and saturated that it seemed less like weather and more like a statement. The snow on the valley floor caught the early light and held it, turning the whole of the landscape into something that a painter might have attempted and then put away unfinished, knowing that the reality of it exceeded what could be made with pigment and intention. The mountains to the west were sharp-edged against that blue sky in a way they rarely were. Every ridgeline defined, every couloir shadowed with precision, as though the storm had cleaned the air of everything impure and left only the essential shapes of things behind. Gideon was outside before full light, breaking ice on the water trough, checking the fence line for damage, doing the work that always accumulated during a stretch of heavy weather. The cold was still serious, the kind that made the inside of the nose ache with the first breath and settled into the fingers within minutes of exposure. But it was a clean cold now, without wind, and there was a quality to the silence it produced that he had always found, in spite of everything, close to restorative. He heard the cabin door. He turned and looked. Waya stood on the porch in the coat he had left on the hook inside his coat, which reached to her mid-thigh and strained across her shoulders in a way that would have been almost comic in any other context. She had her hands at her sides, and she was looking out at the valley with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not the vigilant assessment she brought to every enclosed space, not the controlled neutrality she used in conversation. Something quieter than either of those. Something that had no defenses in it because the thing it was responding to was not a threat. She was looking at the land the way you looked at something you had been told about your entire life and were seeing for the first time. He went back to his work and left her to it. After perhaps 20 minutes, she came down off the porch and walked past him to the eastern edge of the yard, where the fence line ended and the open pasture began. She stopped there and looked south along the creek line, following it with her eyes to where it bent around the base of the low hill and disappeared behind the tree line. Her breath made slow clouds in the cold air. "The creek bends left there," she said, not to him exactly, more to the fact of it. "He said it bent left just before it went behind the hill. He said you could always find where you were by that bend." Gideon straightened up from the water trough. He was right about it. She nodded once, still looking south. Then she turned and walked back toward the cabin, and he noticed for the first time that she was moving with less stiffness than the days before, that the wounds on her back were allowing her more range than they had, and he filed that away as a good sign without making any comment on it. It was mid-morning when he heard the horses. He was inside splitting kindling over the woodbox, the small rhythmic work that he found he could do without much thought when the sound reached him through the cabin walls. Not one horse, several, moving at a pace that was purposeful without being urgent, the pace of people who knew where they were going and were not in any particular hurry about arriving because they were confident of the outcome when they did. He set the hatchet down. He went to the window and looked out. There were 5 of them. 4 riders he recognized as men who worked the large spread to the north hands he had seen in town at various times over the years. the kind of men whose faces carried the specific blankness of people who had decided some time ago that their own judgment was not the relevant instrument. And at the front of the group, riding a gray horse that had cost more than Gideon had paid for this entire 40 acres, was Harlan Voss. Gideon had not seen Voss up close in nearly 4 years. The man was heavier than he had been, and the hair at his temples had gone fully silver, and he wore it the way he wore everything as evidence of a particular kind of success. He sat a horse well. He always had. There was something about the way Voss occupied space, any space that suggested the space had been waiting for him and was glad of his arrival. Beside him on a shorter horse rode a man that Gideon needed a moment to place. Then he placed him. Isaac Pruitt. He had known Isaac years ago peripherally through the kind of casual territorial acquaintance that accumulated when you lived in a place long enough. Isaac was Apache on his mother's side and white on his father's, and he occupied the particular no-man's land that such an origin created in 1883, Wyoming, belonging fully to neither world and navigating both with the careful strategic intelligence of someone who had learned very young that the cost of a wrong step was higher for him than for most. He had worked, Gideon recalled now, as a translator, as a man who moved between languages and communities and carried information in both directions. He was riding beside Harlan Voss. Gideon turned from the window. Waya was standing in the center of the room. She had heard the horses too. She was looking at him, and her face was doing what her face did, giving nothing away, but her eyes had gone to a different quality than their usual steadiness. Not fear, something adjacent to it, but not the same thing. The look of a person confronting a possibility they have been trying not to fully form in their mind. "Do you know who is out there?" she said. "Yes." Both of them. He understood that she had seen through the window before he had turned from it. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment that seemed longer than it was. Then she stepped back deeper into the shadow of the room, out of the direct sight line of the window. Not hiding. Positioning. He went to the door and opened it before they reached the porch. Voss pulled up his horse at the edge of the yard and looked at Gideon with the expression of a man paying a social call that he expects to conclude in his favor. "Gideon," he said. His voice was the same as it had always been, warm and measured, and containing underneath both of those qualities the absolute assurance of a man who had never had a conversation he did not control. "You are looking well. Winter treating you all right out here?" "Well enough," Gideon said. "Good. Good." Voss looked around the yard with the unhurried interest of a man who owned a great deal and was accustomed to assessing whatever came before him. "I heard you had some excitement during the storm. Found something on your property." "I found a person," Gideon said. "On my property." Voss smiled. The smile did not change anything in his eyes. "A manner of speaking. The thing is, Gideon, the woman you took in is party to a labor contract, legally executed, properly witnessed. She walked away from that contract in a manner that creates certain legal obligations." He paused. "I am here as a courtesy, to give you the opportunity to resolve this simply between men who understand each other before it becomes a matter that requires more formal handling." Gideon looked at him. He did not look at Isaac Pruitt, though he was aware of him at the edge of his vision, sitting his horse with his eyes aimed at the middle distance and his face arranged into an expression of professional neutrality. "Show me the contract," Gideon said. "I beg your pardon. The labor contract. Show it to me. I will read it." A brief pause. Voss continued to smile. "I don't carry that sort of paperwork on a morning ride, Gideon. I can have it to you within the week." "Then come back within the week," Gideon said. "With the paper." The smile held, but something behind it shifted a barely perceptible recalibration. "You are a reasonable man," Voss said. "I have always respected that about you, so let me be direct as one reasonable man to another. The woman on your property represents a significant financial investment. The men she injured during her departure represent an ongoing liability. I would prefer to settle this without involving the county sheriff, and I think you would prefer that as well. We both know that legal proceedings have a way of turning up all manner of things that people would rather keep undisturbed." He let that sit. Gideon understood exactly what it meant. He understood which undisturbed things Voss was referring to, and which signature at the bottom of which document would be among the first things turned up if anyone began examining Voss's land dealings with any serious attention. "She stays," Gideon said. The silence that followed was of a different quality than any that had come before it in that conversation. "I see," Voss said. His voice had not changed. His expression had not changed. The only thing that had changed was the quality of his attention, which had sharpened to something that reminded Gideon of a particular kind of winter cold, the kind that did not announce itself but simply found the gaps. "Well, you think on it. I expect you'll find your thinking clarifies over the next few days." He gathered his reins. "I'll send someone by at the end of the week." He turned his horse. Isaac Pruitt turned with him. And as he turned, his eyes moved for one instant to the cabin window, just one instant involuntary, the movement of a man whose body had betrayed what his face was working to conceal. Then he was moving away with the others, and the sound of hooves on packed snow diminished toward the road. Gideon stood on the porch until they were out of sight. Then he went inside and closed the door. Waya was standing at the window just to the side of it, positioned so that she could see out without being seen clearly from the yard. She had watched all of it. She turned when he came in, and he saw that the thing in her eyes that had looked like something adjacent to fear had become something different now, something colder and more specific. "Isaac Pruitt," she said. "You know him." "He was our translator," she said. "For 3 years he moved between our people and the men who came with their papers. We trusted him because he spoke both languages. We thought that meant he understood both sides." She paused. Something moved through her face and then was gone, sealed back behind the controlled surface. "He was the one who told them when I would be traveling alone. He was the one who told them how many would be with me and which route I would take." Gideon said nothing. "He sold me," she said. Not with heat, with a flatness that was in some ways worse. "He sold me and everyone they took with me, for money and for whatever they promised him that money could buy." The room was quiet. "I want you to understand something," she said. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. "I am not afraid of Harlan Voss. I have been afraid of things in my life, things that deserved the fear. Voss is a dangerous man, but what he is not new to me, and I know how to account for it." She paused. "What I did not know how to account for was Isaac. I did not know how to account for a betrayal that came from inside." Gideon looked at her for a moment. "That kind is always harder," he said. She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "It always is." That afternoon, without discussion or preamble, Waya went outside and began repairing a section of fence along the eastern perimeter that had been knocked askew by the storm. He saw her through the window and watched for a moment before going out to work alongside her. They worked without speaking for the better part of an hour, falling into an easy division of the labor that required no negotiation, the comfortable rhythm of two people who understood work and were not self-conscious about the doing of it. At one point he reached for a post that she was also reaching for, and their hands arrived at it at the same moment. Neither of them pulled back. They adjusted without comment and drove the post together, and when it was in, he looked at her and she looked at him, and there was a half-second of something between them that was not quite anything yet, that was still in the process of becoming something, before they both turned back to the fence. That evening he told her what Voss had implied with his comment about legal proceedings. He told her about the land deed and his signature and the specific leverage Voss likely believed he held. He laid it out plainly because she had a right to understand the full geography of their situation, and because he had already decided that there would be no more selective silence between him and this woman if he could help it. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "So he believes you will trade me to protect yourself." "He believes most men would," Gideon said. "He has generally been right about that." She looked at him. "But not you." "Not me," he said. "Not this time." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" He thought about the honest answer to that. "Because I have spent 3 years letting fear be enough of a reason," he said. "I am tired of what that costs." She held his gaze for a long time. Then she looked away out the window at the dark that had come down over the valley. "Voss will not wait a week," she said. "He said it to give himself room. He will move before then." "I know," Gideon said. "Then we do not have much time." "No," he said. "We don't." 3 days passed. In those 3 days the world outside the cabin maintained its cold clarity, the sky staying open, the temperatures dropping further each night and recovering only partially each day. The snow settled and hardened on the ground until it had the texture of salt, and every footstep across the yard made a sound like something being compressed beyond its tolerance. Gideon went to town on the 2nd day. He told Waya where he was going and approximately how long he expected to be, and she nodded without asking him to explain or justify the trip. And when he came back 4 hours later, she was where he had left her, sitting near the stove with the methodical stillness she brought to periods of waiting, the stillness of someone who knew how to be inside themselves without losing track of what was outside. He had gone to see Reverend Cyrus Fenn. The Reverend lived behind his church in a 2-room residence that smelled of old paper and wood smoke and the particular mustiness of a place where a man had lived alone long enough that his solitary habits had become the dominant feature of the atmosphere. He was 65 or thereabouts, with the shrunken posture of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had gradually arranged himself around the weight of it. His eyes, when he opened the door and saw Gideon standing there, went through 3 distinct expressions in rapid succession: recognition, relief, and then a quick contraction of something that might have been guilt. He let Gideon in. Gideon sat across from him at the small table and laid out what he knew and what he needed without embellishment and without the softening that might have made the conversation easier to have. He told Fenn about the woman in his cabin, about the marks on her back that came from Voss's people, about the land deed with the handprint of her father and his own signature beneath it, about Voss's visit and the implication Voss had made and the days he believed they had before Voss moved more decisively. Fenn listened to all of it with his hands folded on the table and his eyes aimed at the space between them. He did not interrupt. When Gideon finished, the old man sat in silence for a long time, long enough that Gideon began to consider what he would do if Fenn simply refused. Then Fenn said, "I know about the land transactions. I have known for 12 years. Gideon waited. "I witnessed 3 of them," Fenn said. "Not as a legal witness, as a man who was present and saw what was being done and said nothing." He paused. "Voss made it very clear what the consequences of speaking would be for the church and for me personally. I chose the church. I chose myself." He looked up. "I have been choosing that for 12 years. I have preached on courage every 4th Sunday for 12 years. "I am not here to judge you," Gideon said. "I need to know if you have anything from those transactions that still exists." Fenn was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Come back tomorrow evening. Alone. After dark." On the evening of the 3rd day, with the temperature outside dropping toward its nightly extreme, Gideon sat across the table from Waya, and they had the conversation that had been building since the night she had looked up from the land deed with her father's handprint on it and found his name on the witness line. It was not a conversation either of them had planned or scheduled. It arrived the way certain necessary conversations arrived, from the accumulated weight of shared space and shared silence and the particular pressure of circumstances that were narrowing toward a point. They had eaten, and the plates had been cleared, and the fire was going well, and outside the night was the specific crystalline dark of a winter night in the mountains, when the sky was clear, and the cold was serious, and the stars were extravagant, and there was a quality to the stillness that made the room feel very small and very complete. "Tell me about your father," Gideon said. She looked at him across the table. The lantern light was between them, and it made the angles of her face more pronounced, the shadows deeper. She looked at him for a long moment with the evaluating attention she brought to everything, and then something in her settled some held thing releasing, and she began to speak. She told him about Gray Elk in the way you told someone about a person you had loved and lost, with the specific details that memory chose to preserve over the general ones. The way he moved through the pre-dawn dark to check on the horses before anyone else was awake, unhurried and completely silent, even on ground that made noise under everyone else's feet. The way he could read the sky 3 days in advance with an accuracy that had seemed like ceremony to her when she was young, and had revealed itself as careful accumulated observation as she grew old enough to understand the difference. The way he had taught her everything she knew about the land, not through instruction exactly, but through proximity and attention, walking her through the same terrain in different seasons until she understood it the way she understood her own body. He was not a man who talked much, she said, but what he said was worth waiting for. She looked at her hands on the table. He used to say that the land did not belong to the people who walked on it. It was the other way. The people belonged to the land, that the land let you live on it because of how you treated it, and if you forgot, that it would find a way to remind you. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He sounds like a man who understood what things were worth. He understood everything, she said, except the paper. She said it without bitterness, which made it more painful than bitterness would have been. He understood everything they would let him understand. The fire made it sound. The night outside made it silence. "I had a brother," Gideon said. He had not intended to say it. It came out of the particular quality of the room, and the moment the way certain things came out when the circumstances were right, not as a choice exactly, but as an inevitability. Younger than me by 6 years, his name was Thomas. He followed me into the army because I did not tell him not to. I did not think he would go if I did not invite him, and I did not think it was my place to tell a grown man what to do. He stopped. The lantern flame bent slightly in a draft from somewhere and then steadied. He did not come back. And I have been working out what to do with that fact for 16 years. I have not found a satisfactory answer. Waya looked at him across the table. Her expression had not changed in any visible way, but the quality of her attention had shifted, had become something more personal than her usual careful observation. "The answer is that there is no satisfactory one," she said. "There is only the question and you and the time you are given." He looked at her. "My father is gone," she said. "The land he walked on is still here. I am still here. Whatever I do with the time I am given, I do as his daughter. That is the only answer I have found." The silence that followed was the most complete silence they had shared. It was not the silence of people who had nothing to say to each other. It was the silence of people who had said something true and were sitting in the space that truth had made, not trying to fill it or diminish it or move past it before its time. Gideon looked across the table at this woman who had come out of a storm with nothing left but her life and her name, and who had survived the particular cruelty of betrayal by someone trusted, and who sat in the firelight of a cabin built on her father's stolen land, and told him the truth about grief with a quietness that was more articulate than anything elaborate could have been. And she looked back at him with the amber eyes that had first measured him for threat and found him insufficient, and then had slowly over days and nights and shared work and shared silence found him something else. Not safe exactly, not what that word usually meant, but present, accountable, trying. "My father's mark is on that deed," she said quietly. "Yes." "And your name?" "Yes." She reached across the table and touched the folded paper that he had taken from his pocket and placed between them at the start of the meal. She did not unfold it. She just touched it with 2 fingers. "Then we are both part of what needs to be fixed," she said. It was the first time she had used a word that included both of them. He registered it. He did not make any comment on it, but he registered it. Later, when the fire had burned to coals and the room had dimmed, and they had both moved to the positions they slept in, she near the stove, and he in his corner, and the particular thick silence of a cold mountain night had settled over everything, she said, "One more thing into the dark. Gideon." It was the first time she had used his name. "Yes," he said, "what Fen has for you." Whatever it is, use it." He stared at the ceiling. "I intend to." A pause. Then very quietly, with a quality in her voice he had not heard there before, something not quite warm yet, but moving in that direction, the way ice moved toward water, given the right conditions. "Good." He did not sleep for a long time after that. He lay in the dark and thought about the particular way courage worked, how it was never available when you needed it in the past and was always slightly terrifying when it finally arrived in the present, and how the only way to meet it was the way you met the worst of the winter cold, by stopping the effort to stay warm through endurance alone and choosing instead to go toward the fire. The next evening he went to Reverend Fenn's residence after dark as instructed. The old man opened the door before Gideon knocked, as though he had been standing on the other side of it waiting. He was holding a leather-bound ledger old enough that the cover had gone dark and smooth with handling, and his hands around it were the hands of a man holding something he had wanted to put down for a very long time and was not sure he trusted himself to release without ceremony. He held it out to Gideon. "This is Voss's financial record of the transactions," Fenn said. "The land dealings, the contracts, the names." He paused. "The payments. To the people he paid to facilitate things. County officials. The land recorder's office." His voice had gone to the monotone of someone reciting something they have rehearsed to get through. "The amounts and the dates and the names are all in there. I copied it from his personal ledger in the winter of 1874. I told myself at the time I was keeping it as protection, in case he ever turned on me." He stopped. "That was a lie, I told myself. I kept it because I knew even then that what was being done was wrong, and I could not find the courage to say so in any way that cost me anything, so I held on to the evidence as a way of telling myself that someday I would." Gideon took the ledger. It was heavier than it looked with the specific gravity of what it held inside. "There are names in there," Fenn said. "That will surprise you, and some that will not." Gideon looked at him. "Isaac Pruitt." Fenn closed his eyes briefly. "Third page, 1881. Gideon put the ledger under his arm. He looked at the old man for a moment, at the shrunken posture and the hands that had finally let go of what they had been holding, at the face that was doing something complicated with what it was feeling. "It is not too late to matter," Gideon said. "If that is a question you are asking yourself." Fenn looked at him. "Is it not?" Gideon thought about it honestly. "I do not know if it makes up for the time," he said. "But I think it matters now. I think what you do in the next week will matter regardless of what came before it." The old man nodded. A small movement, not certain, but committed. Gideon walked back through the dark to his horse. Overhead the winter stars were unreasonable in their abundance, the kind of sky that a person raised in cities never quite believed when they first saw it, the kind that made the darkness feel less like an absence and more like a presence, something thick and full and containing everything that the daylight was too loud to let you hear. He rode back through it toward the light of his cabin with the ledger under his arm and the land deed in his pocket, and for the first time in 3 years, the specific feeling of a man who has stopped running and turned around to face the direction he came from. It was not comfortable, but it was better than the alternative. It was he was beginning to understand the only way anything worth building ever got started. The morning Gideon spread the ledger open on the table, Waya stood across from him and read every page. She read slowly, the way she read everything in English, with the thorough, deliberate attention of someone who had learned the language as a tool rather than a birthright, and therefore trusted it less and checked it more carefully. He watched her work through the columns of figures and the names beside them and the dates that placed each transaction in its particular season and year. He watched her reach the third page, the entry from 1881, and he watched her face when she found Isaac Pruitt's name there, alongside a figure in dollars that was not large by any measure except the measure of what it had purchased. She looked at that entry for a long time. Then she turned the page and kept reading. When she finished, she closed the ledger and placed both hands flat on the cover and stood with her eyes aimed at the wall beyond the table. The morning light came through the window at a low winter angle and caught the side of her face, the strong line of her jaw, the place at her temple where a vein ran close to the surface, and Gideon watched her in that light, and understood that he was watching a person absorb the full documented scale of what had been done, not just to her, not just to her father, but to the extended network of people whose names appeared in those pages. Alongside dollar amounts, their lives reduced to line items in a private ledger that a frightened old man had kept for 12 years in a room behind a church. She lifted her hands from the ledger. "How many people?" she said. Not a question exactly. More. The beginning of a thought she was completing aloud. "Counting the entries from all 3 counties." Gideon said, 26 that I can identify. There may be more from before 1874 that are not in this record." She nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing information rather than reacting to it. "My sister's name," she said. Page 7, November 1883. She did not open the ledger again to find it. She had already read it. She was simply confirming that he had seen it too, that the fact of it existed between them and not only inside her. "There is a location listed beside her name," Gideon said carefully. "A property 40 miles north. Listed as a labor holding under a different name, but the ownership traces back to Voss through 2 intermediaries." He paused. Isaac would know the exact location. He processed the transfer. Wyatt looked at him. The amber of her eyes in the morning light was very clear, very direct, and carrying something that he understood was not a request. It was a statement of what she intended to do regardless of any other consideration offered to him as information rather than as a question of his participation. "I am going," she said. "I know," he said. "We both are." She looked at him for a moment longer. Something shifted in her expression. A very small movement, the kind that was easy to miss, and that he had learned over the past 10 days to watch for. Then she turned to the window and looked out at the yard and the fence line and the valley beyond, and he could see in the set of her shoulders the process of calculating the way a person with military experience looked at a situation and broke it into its components and began assigning each component to a category of solvable or not solvable and working from there. "Isaac," she said. "He knows where she is." "Yes. And he will not give that willingly." "No," Gideon agreed. "But he might give it usefully if the alternative is worse than the giving." She turned back from the window. "What do you have to offer him that is worse than what Voss will do to him if he talks?" Gideon had thought about this carefully on the ride back from Fens the night before. "Voss's worst is uncertain," he said. "It depends on Voss remaining free to administer it. But if Voss's ledger reaches the right people before Voss can act, then Voss's worst becomes unavailable, and what Isaac is left with is only what the law decides to do with him. A man who cooperates with an investigation before he is compelled to is treated differently than a man who is compelled." Wyatt thought about this. "He will know that." "He will know that," Gideon confirmed. "He is a man who calculates his options. We need to give him a calculation that produces the right answer." "And the ledger," she said. "Where does it go?" Gideon reached across the table and picked it up. "Reverend Fenn is sending a copy by Ryder to a newspaper editor in Cheyenne this morning. A man named Aldrich who has been trying to document Voss's land dealings for 2 years and has lacked the documentary evidence to publish." He set the ledger down. "The original goes to a lawyer in Laramie named Garrett, who is the only legal man within 100 miles whose name does not appear in these pages." Wyatt looked at him steadily. "You arranged all of this last night." "Fenn and I arranged it together," he said. "He knows both men. Aldrich will publish within the week if the material is what Fenn says it is. Garrett can file an injunction against Voss's property transactions while an investigation is opened." He paused. "None of that happens fast enough to help Leah today. The legal process will take months, possibly longer. What happens today is different from what happens in the courts. Both matter." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have thought carefully about this." "I have had 12 years of thinking about it and doing nothing," he said. "I know the shape of the problem." Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile but was in the family of one. Then it was gone, and she was already moving, going to the corner of the room where she had kept her few possessions through the days of recovery, organizing them with the efficient brevity of someone who had lived much of her life in conditions that required readiness. "We will need to move before Voss does," she said. "You said he would not wait a week." "I do not think he will wait past tomorrow," Gideon said. "Then today," she said. "We go today." He looked at her for a moment. Her back was mostly healed, or healed enough, the deep wounds having closed under the treatment of the past 10 days, with a speed that still impressed him. She moved without the careful guarding she had shown in the first days. She was, he understood, functionally ready, and the question of whether she should rest longer was one she had already answered for herself without consulting him, which was her right. Today, he agreed. He went to find Isaac Pruitt. He found him at the edge of town in a rented room above the feed store, which was where men in Isaac's particular position in that particular town tended to end up neither poor enough for the boarding house at the south end nor established enough for the hotel. Isaac opened the door on the second knock, and his face, when he saw Gideon, went through a rapid sequence of expressions before settling on the careful neutrality that Gideon had seen him wearing on horseback beside Voss 3 days prior. "Marsh," he said. "I need 5 minutes," Gideon said. Isaac looked past him at the stairwell and the street door at the bottom of it. Then he stepped back and let Gideon in. The room was small and arranged with a neatness that spoke of a man who maintained control over his immediate environment because many other things were not controllable. Isaac sat on the edge of the bed. Gideon stood. He put the ledger on the table beside the door and watched Isaac's eyes go to it and stay there. "Fenn's copy," Isaac said. His voice was flat. "You knew he had it." "I knew he had seen things. I suspected he had written them down. Fenn is the kind of man who writes things down and then lacks the courage to use them." He looked up from the ledger to Gideon's face. "Until now, apparently." "The original is on its way to Laramie," Gideon said. "A copy goes to Cheyenne today. The editor at the Territorial Gazette has been waiting for documentation for 2 years. He watched Isaac process this. "Voss will know by the end of the week, possibly sooner if he has someone at the post road, which I assume he does." Isaac was quiet for a moment. "What do you want from me?" "Leah Stonehorse," Gideon said. "The location. And you will come with us to confirm it because I do not trust a description alone." The silence in that small room was significant. Isaac looked at the ledger. He looked at his own hands, which were resting on his knees with a stillness that was costing him something. He was a man in the process of calculating exactly as Gideon had anticipated, running the numbers of his situation against the numbers of his options and arriving at the only sum that made sense. "If Voss goes down," Isaac said carefully, "my name is in that ledger." "Your name is in that ledger regardless," Gideon said. "The question is whether your name is also in the record of the investigation as a cooperating witness or only as a subject of it." More silence. "She will not forgive me," Isaac said. And it was strange because his voice when he said it was not the voice of a man concerned with his own standing. It was the voice of a man saying something true that he had no expectation of being argued with about. Isaac was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and put a folded paper on the table beside the ledger. "My wife found this in my things last week. She has not spoken to me since. I do not know where she has gone." He looked at the paper. "It is the transfer documentation for Leah Stonehorse. I kept it because I kept everything. I did not know at the time that keeping everything would eventually matter in this particular way." He paused. "The location is written on the back." Isaac looked up at him, and for a moment, under the careful strategic surface of the man who had survived by knowing which way the wind was blowing and positioning himself accordingly, Gideon could see the outline of someone younger, someone who had made a choice in a bad moment and had been living inside the consequences of it ever since. "I will take you," Isaac said. They rode out within the hour, the three of them, Gideon and Waya and Isaac, with Isaac at the front, because he knew the route, and because putting him at the front was the clearest possible statement of the terms of his participation. The cold was serious, but not brutal. the air having risen a few degrees from its overnight extreme, and the sky was the same deep, clear blue it had been since the storm ended, a sky that offered no shelter and no concealment, and nothing but the truth of the distance in every direction. Waya rode beside Gideon and slightly behind Isaac, positioned with a precision that was not accidental. She had not spoken to Isaac directly. She had looked at him once when he came out of the feed store and seen her standing with the horses, and she had held that look for 3 full seconds, and then she had turned to her horse and mounted without a word. Isaac had not tried to speak to her. He had the look of a man who understood that some debts could not be negotiated. They rode for 3 hours. The terrain north of town was more broken than the valley, the ground rising and falling in a series of long ridges that ran roughly east to west and required the trail to wind between them rather than cutting straight. The snow was deeper up here, less settled, and the horses moved through it with the shortened, careful steps of animals reading the ground beneath the surface. Gideon watched the landscape and watched Waya and watched Isaac, and he let the rhythm of the ride do what it always did, which was to clarify the mind by occupying the body. Halfway through the journey, on a long flat stretch between 2 ridges where the trail widened enough to ride abreast, Waya came up alongside him and said quietly, without looking at him, "There will be men at the property." "Most likely," he said. "How many?" "I do not know. Isaac says 4 or 5 usually, but the number varies." "And you," she said, "how long since you have done something like this?" He thought about it honestly. The war, 30 years. But some things the body does not entirely forget. She looked at him, then a quick, direct assessment. "No," she said, "it does not." And then she fell back to her position again, and he rode with the words and what they contained, which was a significant amount in the silence of his own thoughts. The property appeared between 2 rises in the late morning, a collection of low structures that had been built for function, and nothing else, unpainted, graceless, arranged around a central yard, that the snow had turned the same uniform white as everything else, so that the whole of it looked briefly like something natural, before the eye resolved the specific shapes of human construction from the landscape. There was smoke from 2 of the structures. There were horses in a small corral at the eastern edge. There was a man visible near the corral working at something with his back to them. They stopped on the rise. Isaac pointed out what he knew: the main building where the workers were housed, the smaller building at the north end where the overseer stayed, the storage building that was also used, he said, with the flat voice of someone reporting a fact they have decided to report without editorial, as a containment space for people who were considered flight risks. Waya was looking at the storage building. "How many inside?" she said to Isaac. "When I was last here, 8, he said. "That was 6 weeks ago. The number changes." 8, she said, "or near it." She looked at the building for another moment. Then she looked at Gideon. The look carried everything they had said to each other and everything they had not said, the ledger and the land deed and the names in both the nights in the cabin and the morning light and the creek bend that her father had described to her, so she would always know where she was, and underneath all of that something simpler and more immediate, the look of 2 people who have decided to do a difficult thing together and are confirming that the decision still holds. He nodded. They rode down. The man at the corral heard them coming and turned, and his hand went toward something at his hip, and then he saw Gideon and held, because Gideon was a white man on a horse, and the situation required a different assessment than reflex allowed for. That half-second of recalibration was enough. Gideon was off his horse, and the conversation had shifted before the man had finished his initial assessment. Gideon did not reach for the weapon at his own hip. He had learned in the war that a weapon you did not draw was a more powerful thing in many situations than one you had already committed to, because it kept the future open in a way that a drawn weapon did not. He stated plainly who he was and what he was there for, and what he had in his saddlebag that would be on its way to Laramie and Cheyenne within days. He stated it with the unhurried specificity of a man who had prepared what he needed to say and was saying it without the distortions that fear or anger introduced. He told the man at the corral that his employer was going to have a significant legal problem in the very near future, and that the men who worked for him had a choice about which side of that problem they wanted to be on when it arrived. The man at the corral looked at him. He looked at Waya, who had dismounted and stood near her horse with the complete and grounded stillness of someone who had no anxiety about the outcome of the next few minutes, only a clear understanding of what she intended to do, regardless of what that outcome was. He looked at Isaac, whose presence there told him something that shifted the calculation further. He stepped back from the corral gate. Waya was already moving toward the storage building. The door was secured with a bar rather than a lock, which spoke to the priorities of the people who had built it and what they had expected to need to contain. She lifted the bar and pulled the door open and stood in the frame of it for a moment before going in, and Gideon watched from where he stood and saw the moment her eyes adjusted to the interior dark. He heard her exhale, and then he heard from inside that dark space a sound that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Not a word. Just a voice young, rising from somewhere between sleep and waking at the sudden inrush of cold air and light, a voice saying a name. The same name Waya had said in the dark of his cabin 4 nights before in the shallow end of a dream. He did not go to the door. He stayed where he was and let that reunion happen in the privacy it deserved. Behind him, Isaac Pruitt sat on his horse and looked at his hands. After a time, Gideon walked to the main building and knocked. The door was opened by a man in his 40s who had the look of someone who had been told this morning might bring complications, and had not decided yet how complicated he was willing to let it get. Gideon gave him the same speech he had given the man at the corral with the same calm and the same specificity, and added to it the name of the lawyer in Laramie and the name of the editor in Cheyenne, and suggested that the man might want to think carefully about what his own name appearing in either of those contexts would mean for his future in this territory. The man in the doorway looked past Gideon to where Waya was now standing in the yard with a young woman who was leaning into her in the particular way of someone whose body had given up its independent posture and was relying entirely on the person beside it to remain vertical. He looked at Gideon. "How many are in there?" Gideon said. A pause. 7, the man said. "All of them are leaving today," Gideon said. "And you are going to help me arrange it." The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway. That was when the horses came. Gideon heard them before he saw them, the sound carrying clearly in the cold, dry air coming from the south road, and he stepped out of the doorway and looked and counted and felt with a very calm and specific certainty that the next few minutes had just become more complicated than he had planned for. Voss had not waited until tomorrow. There were 6 riders, and Harlan Voss was not among them, which was the way Voss had always operated, sending the men who could be replaced to do the work that carried risk. The man at the front was someone Gideon did not know heavy-set, and riding with the forward lean of a man who expected to arrive at a disagreement and had opinions about how it should be resolved. Gideon stepped into the center of the yard. He looked at the 6 horses. He looked at the 6 men. He looked at his own situation, which was one aging rancher with a revolver at his hip and the specific weight of the past 12 years bearing down on the next 30 seconds. Waya appeared at his left shoulder. He had not heard her move. She was simply there, tall enough that the riders on horseback were not looking down at her from any significant advantage, and she was looking at the 6 men with an expression that was not threatening because it did not need to be. It was the expression of someone for whom this was not new, for whom the encounter of her single presence against multiple armed opponents was a situation she had been trained for and had survived before, and who was communicating all of that without any theatrics whatsoever. Behind the riders coming up the south road at a pace that was not hurried because it did not need to be were 2 more horses, and on those horses were Sheriff Douglas Crane of the county and a deputy whose name Gideon did not know. The heavy-set man at the front of Voss's riders saw the sheriff at the same moment Gideon registered him, and the calculation that crossed his face was brief and visible and arrived at the only sensible conclusion. Crane rode past Voss's men without looking at them. He pulled up in the center of the yard and looked at Gideon, and then at the storage building with its door standing open, and then at Waya beside Gideon, and then at the yard more generally, taking the inventory of it with the practiced eye of a man who had ridden into a great many situations that were already in progress and had learned to read them quickly. He reached into his coat and took out a folded document. "I have a wire from the territorial governor's office," he said. He said it to no one in particular and to everyone, regarding a complaint filed yesterday afternoon by a lawyer in Laramie named Garrett concerning the land and labor dealings of one Harlan Voss. "Pending investigation, I have authority to secure any persons currently held under labor contracts affiliated with Voss Properties." He looked at Gideon. "It appears someone was moving faster than I expected." "Fenn's rider left 2 days ago," Gideon said, "before Voss came to my property." Crane looked at him for a moment. "Reverend Fenn." He said it with the tone of a man who was revising several assumptions simultaneously. "All right." He looked at the 6 riders. "You men can turn around." The heavy-set man started to say something. "You can turn around," Crane said again with the specific quality of repetition that did not invite further discussion. They turned around. Gideon released a breath that he had been holding. He realized since the moment he had heard the horses on the south road. He released it quietly and without drama, because there was no one he wanted to perform relief for, and because the work was not yet done. He turned to find Waya. She was kneeling in the snow beside Leah, not because the position was comfortable for her, but because it put her at the same level as the girl who was sitting in the snow with her knees drawn up and her eyes at a level that Gideon recognized the specific middle distance of someone whose interior landscape had recently been rearranged by things too large to be immediately processed. He watched Waya put her hand on the side of Leah's face, a gesture of absolute tenderness offered without self-consciousness by a woman who had maintained a careful and controlled surface in every other moment he had witnessed. She said something in Apache, low and continuous, and Leah closed her eyes and leaned into the hand. Gideon looked away. He went to speak with the sheriff. The legal proceedings against Harlan Voss began in the second week of January in the county courthouse in a town 40 miles east, and they continued for the better part of 5 months. Gideon attended when his presence was required and did not attend when it was not. He gave his testimony in the careful, measured sentences of a man who had rehearsed honesty until it came as naturally as its opposite once had, and he answered every question about his signature on the land deed with the same straightforward account he had given Waya across the table in his cabin. He did not soften it, and he did not elaborate on it in ways that were self-serving. He said what had happened and what he had known and when he had known it and what he had done about it and when. The lawyer Garrett was precise and thorough, and the ledger from Fenn gave him a documented foundation that made the proceedings considerably more navigable than they would have been otherwise. The editor Aldrich published his account in the Cheyenne Territorial Gazette in the 3rd week of January, and the account was detailed and sourced and carried the specific authority of documentary evidence rather than allegation, and it was picked up by 2 papers further east within the month. Voss hired lawyers from Chicago. The lawyers from Chicago were good. They were, in fact, significantly better than anything the territorial legal system could readily counter. And there were moments in the early months of the proceedings when it seemed possible that the documented weight of the ledger would not be enough to overcome the procedural advantages that money could purchase in a territorial court in 1884. There were nights in those months when Gideon sat in his cabin and looked at the fire and thought about the possibility that it would not be enough that the system that had enabled Voss's operations for 12 years would prove capable of protecting him from their consequences. He thought about those nights afterward as the nights that taught him the difference between doing the right thing, because it would certainly succeed, and doing the right thing because it was right. He had spent 12 years waiting for certainty. Certainty, he had learned, was not something the world issued in advance. Isaac Pruitt testified in February. He appeared in the courthouse in a dark suit that he had clearly acquired specifically for the occasion, and he sat in the witness chair with the upright posture of a man who had made a decision about how he was going to carry himself through the next several hours and was committed to it. He answered the questions put to him with a directness that surprised several people in the courtroom and did not surprise Gideon, who had sat across a small table from Isaac in a rented room and understood that the man, whatever else he was intelligent enough to recognize a moment of singular importance when it arrived and to rise to it even if the rising cost him considerably. Isaac's testimony was the most specific and damaging of all the accounts given. He knew names and dates and locations and the internal logistics of operations that no one else had the detailed knowledge to describe. He gave all of it. He held nothing back that was relevant. When the questioning was done and he stood to leave the witness chair, he looked for just a moment at the back of the courtroom where Gideon was sitting. Gideon nodded once. Isaac walked out without looking at anything else. The 7 people from the labor camp north of town were a more complicated matter. 3 had family they could return to. 2 had come from bands so scattered by the preceding decade that no clear return was possible, and they stayed through the winter in arrangements that Crane facilitated with the grudging cooperation of the territorial office. 2 others were from a different nation entirely taken during a raid 3 counties west, and their journey home took most of the spring to arrange. Gideon contributed what he could to the cost of it, which was not much, and did not mention it to anyone. Voss was convicted in April on 4 counts with additional charges pending in 2 other counties. The sentence was significant. The Chicago lawyers filed an appeal. Garrett told Gideon the appeal would likely fail given the documentation, but that it would take time. These things always took time. The land question was more complicated. The legal restoration of lands taken through fraudulent conveyance was not a simple matter in Wyoming Territory in 1884, and Garrett told Gideon this plainly and without false comfort. The process would require separate filings and separate proceedings and would face resistance from multiple parties with financial interests in the current arrangements. Some of the land that had been taken would be recoverable. Some would not. Some was already in the hands of third parties who had purchased in good faith and presented a different category of legal problem entirely. The 40 acres where Gideon's cabin stood was not in that complicated category. He went to Garrett's office on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of March, and he filed the paperwork to add Wyatt Stonehorse's name to the property deed as co-owner. Garrett looked at him over the document for a moment before signing it as witness. "This is unusual," Garrett said, "not as an objection, as an observation." "Most things worth doing are," Gideon said. When he came home that evening, Wyatt was on the south fence line with Leah walking the perimeter. The way he had seen her walk it several times over the weeks, not checking the fence for damage, but simply walking the boundary of the land, learning it through her feet. The way her father had taught her land was learned. He could see the 2 of them from the road, the tall figure of Wyatt and the smaller figure of Leah beside her, moving in the low, late afternoon light, with the unhurried purpose of people who are going somewhere specific within a space that is theirs. He put the horses up and went inside and started the fire. Leah had been with them for 6 weeks by then. She was not the same person she had been before November, and Wyatt had said clearly and without sentimentality in the 3rd week that she probably never would be entirely that certain kinds of experience left permanent marks, the way certain kinds of weather left permanent marks on the landscape, altering the drainage patterns and the tree lines in ways that persisted long after the original event. What Leah was Wyatt said was alive and accounted for and surrounded by people who were not going anywhere, and those things mattered more than restoration to an original condition that could not in any case be recovered. She was eating well. She was sleeping mostly with the occasional night that required Wyatt's presence in the manner of the early nights, the 2 of them sitting near the stove until whatever the dark had brought receded back to a manageable distance. She had begun in the past week to ask questions about the fence and the horses and the particular qualities of different types of wood for different uses. The practical, curious questions of a person who is beginning to invest attention in a specific place because some part of them has decided that specific place might be worth the investment. Gideon answered every question seriously and in full. In the evenings when the work was done and the fire was going and the 3 of them were in the cabin together, there was a quality to the time that Gideon had difficulty naming precisely. It was not what he had imagined a family to be in the years when he had imagined such things, which were mostly years ago now. It was rougher than that, and more contingent, assembled from the materials that circumstances had made available rather than from any prior plan, and it had gaps and silences and complications that any honest account of it would have to include. But it was real in a way that the previous 10 years of his solitary life had not been real, or had been real only in the thinner sense that anything purely functional was real. This had weight to it. It had the weight of people who needed things from each other and were learning carefully and with occasional difficulty to provide them. One evening in the middle of March, Waya sat across from him at the table after Leah had gone to sleep, and she said without particular preamble, "I want to learn to read the land documents." He looked up from what he was doing. "The legal language," she said. "I want to understand it myself, not to rely on someone else's translation." He thought about what she was describing and what it meant that she was describing it and what it would require of both of them for the next several months. "All right," he said. "You will teach me." "I will try," he said. "There are parts of it I do not fully understand myself. We may need Garrett for some of it." She nodded. "Then we use Garrett for what we cannot do ourselves and do the rest ourselves." She paused. "This is how it should have been for my father. He should have had access to the language." "Yes," Gideon said. "He should have." "I am going to have it," she said. Not with heat, with the flat, declarative certainty she brought to things she had decided. "For whatever comes next." He looked at her across the table in the firelight, this woman who had come out of a winter storm with nothing but her life and the knowledge of what had been taken, and who had survived the particular devastation of betrayal from inside her own circle of trust, and who had sat in the cabin of the man whose signature had helped take her father's land, and had made the decision not to forgive exactly, but to stay and to use what was available and to build something from what remained. She was looking back at him with the amber eyes that had measured him for threat in the first seconds of consciousness, and had found in the weeks since a different measure to apply. "What are you thinking?" she said. He had not meant to be obvious about the thinking. "That you are a remarkable person," he said. He said it simply because it was true, and because he had decided some time ago that the habit of understating true things was a habit he wanted to be done with. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I know," and the corner of her mouth moved in the way it occasionally moved, not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one the shape the face made when something landed correctly. He laughed. It surprised him. It had been a while since something had surprised him into laughter. She looked at him with an expression that was more open than most expressions she allowed herself, and she said with a quietness that was not tentative but simply appropriately sized for what it was carrying, "I did not expect this." "Which part?" he said. She considered. "Any of it," she said. "The man who lived on my father's land. I expected him to be one kind of person. He was a different kind." He waited. "I did not expect to want to stay," she said. "I expected to recover and leave. I expected this to be a place I passed through." She looked at the table at the document he had been working on before she had spoken at the surface of the wood with its years of use worn into it. "I have been trying to understand why I want to stay." "Have you arrived at an answer?" he said. She looked up at him. "Several," she said. "The land is part of it. Leah, the work." She paused. A brief pause waited. "You." The fire made its sound. Outside the cabin the Wyoming night was doing what it did, cold and enormous and full of stars that had no opinion about anything happening beneath them. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. A simple gesture without drama, without any of the elaborate emotional architecture that such gestures sometimes carried. She looked at his hand on hers for a moment. Then she turned her hand over and closed her fingers around his and held on with a firmness that was not possessive but was steady, the grip of someone who had decided this was something they intended to hold. They sat that way for a while without speaking, and the silence was the best kind of silence, the kind that was full rather than empty, the kind that two people made together when they had stopped needing to fill the space between them with anything other than what was already there. The first week of April brought a morning that felt different from all the mornings before it. Gideon woke to light through the window that was not the flat gray light of winter, but something with warmth in it, a quality of promise that the winter months stripped from the air so gradually that you forgot it existed until the day it came back. He lay still for a moment and felt it through the glass, and understood before he opened his eyes fully that the season had shifted in the night. one of those imperceptible thresholds that were only visible in retrospect, the way most important thresholds were. He got up and went outside. The snow on the south-facing slope below the cabin had pulled back from the fence line, leaving a strip of dark, wet earth exposed along the base of the posts. The creek in the low ground had opened where the ice had been thinnest, and he could hear it from where he stood, the specific sound of moving water resuming its conversation with the rocks after the long winter's interruption. The sky was pale blue and cloudless, and the air was cold but differently cold without the edge that had been in it for months. He stood on the porch for a long time. The door opened behind him and Waya came out pulling his coat around her shoulders in the way she had taken to doing in the mornings, which he had noticed and said nothing about. She stood beside him and looked at the valley. After a while she walked down off the porch and across the yard to the eastern fence line. She went through the gate and walked out into the pasture to the place where the ground began to slope downward toward the creek, and she stopped there and stood with her boots in the cold mud of the newly exposed earth, the first mud of the new season. She looked south along the creek to where it bent left just before it went behind the hill. Her left hand rested at her side, and the small carved bone at her wrist caught the morning light the way it always did, the way her father's hands had caught it working in the early hours before anyone else was awake. He watched her from the porch. After a moment, Leah appeared in the doorway behind him, still in the half-dressed state of someone who has woken to something that pulled them outside before they were entirely ready. She looked at Waya in the pasture. She looked at the strip of dark earth along the fence line. She looked at the sky. "Is it spring?" she said. "Getting there," Gideon said. She stood beside him, and they both looked at Waya, who was standing in the field with the mud of her father's land under her boots, and the morning light coming across the valley from the east. Then Leah said, "What do we do today?" Gideon thought about the fence sections that still needed work. The roof of the small shed behind the stable that had not survived the winter's snow load entirely. The garden plot on the south side of the cabin that had not been planted in 3 years, which was too long. The room he had been planning to add to the east side of the cabin where the morning light came in longest and strongest, which would need to be started before the ground softened too much to permit the work. "We start building," he said. He went inside for his coat and his tools. When he came back out, Waya had returned from the pasture and she was standing in the yard looking at the east wall of the cabin with the evaluating attention she brought to structural questions, her head tilted slightly, measuring something with her eye that she had not yet put into words. She said without looking at him, "The east wall needs to be higher than you planned." He stopped beside her and looked at the wall. "What height?" "High enough to see the valley from inside," she said. "When we are in the room, I want to be able to see where the creek bends." He looked at the wall and then at the angle of the valley and the sight line that the change in height would create. "That is possible," he said. She looked at him. In the morning light her eyes were very clear and carrying something that had taken a long time to arrive there and was not going anywhere. "Then build it that way," she said. He looked at her for a moment. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Leah appeared from inside with her own coat and a look of someone ready to be given something useful to do. Waya pointed her toward the lumber stack without preamble, and Leah went without comment, and the three of them began the work of the day in the manner of people who had learned each other's rhythms and no longer needed to narrate them. The hammer's sound went out across the yard and down the slope and across the valley, steady and unhurried, carrying in the clear cold air of a Wyoming morning that was becoming 1 hour at a time something other than winter. The creek bent left just before it went behind the hill exactly where Gray Elk had said it would. The land remembered everything, and the people standing on it, learning each other and learning the ground beneath them, were beginning carefully and without rush to remember too. It was enough. For the first time in a very long time, for all three of them in their different ways and from their different distances, it was enough.